Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Are we ready for the next session? So these sessions will be on ASEAN in the Sea of Change, Centrality and Coherence. We already have a very distinguished panelist with us today that will explain to you or even interrogate the theme of this session further. Nah, sesi ini akan dilakukan dalam bahasa Inggris. So all of the panelists will be presenting their views in English. And then we will have a question and answer session later. Kalau nanti pada saat question and answer sessions-nya ada yang mau bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia, nggak apa-apa, please do. Don't be shy, shoot away. Nanti saya terjemahkan ke panelisnya. Oke? Nah, without further ado, sebelum mulai, I want to first ask this very simple question. How many of you are from outside of Jakarta? Is anybody from outside of Jakarta? Awesome. The lady in the red, where is from? Where? Wow. And the lady in hijab, where are you from? Malang, all the way here. Awesome. Good to see people from outside of Jakarta. It's great to see enthusiasm about ASEAN that does not come from the capital city alone. And it's also good to know that today we have speakers from all over ASEAN that will grace us with their views on the issue. So let's have all the panelists come to the stage. To all the panelists, please come and join me. So all of these panelists are distinguished people. They are academics, diplomats, journalists. They are people who are breathing and living about ASEAN for a long time. They have been doing this as a research, as a practice for decades. And it is my honor to share the stage with them today and to give way for them to present their views on the very important issue of our time. So I would like first to introduce to you all of the panelists. First, we have Ambassador Jose Tavares. Please give a round of applause. His Excellency Jose Tavares is Director General for ASEAN Cooperation at Indonesia Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before here, he was the Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Indonesia to the UN and Deputy Chief of Indonesia's mission to UNESCO. His Excellency was also Ambassador at New Zealand and Samoa and Tonga, if I'm not mistaken, sir. And next, we also have Dr. Tang Siew. Please have a round of applause for Dr. Tang Siew. Dr. Tang Siew is the head of the very prestigious ASEAN Studies Center at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute.
My hotel.
Before chairing that institute, he was Director for Foreign Policy and Security Studies at ISEAS, Institute of Strategic and International Studies. And he was also Senior Lecturer at the University Kebangsaan Malaysia. His writing has been well known to everybody who is working on ASEAN-related issues. Next, we have also Kun Kavi Chongkittavorn. Kun Kavi is a veteran on ASEAN. He is a senior fellow at Chulalongkorn University's Institute of Security and International Studies. He was the president of Thai Journalists Association, and he also worked at ASEAN Secretariat as Special Assistant to the Secretary General of ASEAN in Jakarta. Kun Kavi also co-founded and editor-in-chief for the Myanmar Times. Next, we have Professor Richard Heydarian. Please have a round of applause to Professor Heydarian. Professor Heydarian is academic fellow at Stratbase ADR-Institute. He's currently analyst at GMA Network, and he is a regular writer and contributor for Forbes, SCMP, Al Jazeera, NCS, IS, as well as Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. A very prolific writer and thinker, his views has been based as a consultation with numerous luminaries around the region as well. And last but not least, we have Ms. Le Tu Ha. Ms. Le Tu Ha is the research fellow at Bien Dong Institute for Maritime Studies, Diplomat Academy of Vietnam, which is the affiliate of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam. She was research fellow at Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, New York, United States, and she was a research fellow at the Foreign Service Training Center, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vietnam. So as you see, all of the panelists know a lot about the issue. We have people who are working from within the system as diplomats. We have people who are observing closely the system for a long period of time, both as a researcher and journalist. And we have people who take a cautious distance with the issue, to take a grand look of the thing as an academic. So I'm sure in today's session, we will have a very fruitful discussion on the issue. ASEAN in a sea of change, the struggle for centrality and coherence. This is a very tough issue, ladies and gentlemen, which is why I feel very lucky that today I am the moderator and I can ask them the questions instead of being asked the question. Because this seems to me is the million-dollar question right now. ASEAN is, as a region, Southeast Asia, is a very strategic one, it will seem today, where there are potential clash points, while at the same time, there are potential solutions for peace. Countries in the region seems to be embroiled in a potential hegemonic transition in the region. We are looking at a declining roles of major powers, and at the same time, emerging ones, and then even a rising major powers in the region as well. The region does not lack security challenges. From within, we have South China Sea. From nearby, we have the Korean Peninsula. At the same time, the region also does not seem to lack for answer. ASEAN as an institution seems to have multiple acronyms, multiple related bodies. We have the East Asian Forum, ASEAN Regional Forum, the Asian Plus mechanisms, all of which are attempted to build confidence for peaceful solutions and peaceful resolution of dispute. So here, with us today, we have people who can provide you with a better view from near, from afar, and an overhead view of the situation. So without further ado, I will invite the first speaker for today, Kun Kavi, to provide this presentation. Kun Kavi, the floor is yours.
Terima kasih. Selamat siang. Apa khabar? Saya dari Muang Thai. สวัสดีครับ I have 3 points to make about ASEAN centrality. First of all, I'm very happy to be here. This morning, I heard all your leaders spoke about ASEAN. I was very happy. 3 points I want to make. Number 1, ASEAN relevancies. Second, ASEAN centralities. And third, ASEAN cardinal principle of consensus and non-interference. The first one, ASEAN is alive and kicking. And in the seas of change, full of turbulence, ASEAN is still very strong. It's a big ship with a strong captain. And today, if you listen to Dino, to Ratno, and all the history of Indonesia as a middle power, maritime power, Fulcrum, you can be sure Indonesia is in the center of the control room. You agree with me? Applaud, please. Today we have to applaud Indonesia.
Audience participation.
So this is the most important that ASEAN is kicking. And ASEAN is kicking, you know why? Number one, we have no enemy. Everybody wants to be our friends. Whenever we have a meeting, people come. So this is important. We are benign power. We make no enemy. So people love us. And that is an asset. People always say we are a talk shop. If you don't talk, you want us to fight. If you want to fight, go away. In Thai, we will say, go far, far. You know? So go away. If you want peace, let we talk. And then we can have durian later. Secondly, ASEAN Centrality. A lot of people are asking about ASEAN Centrality without understanding that ASEAN Centrality is the evolutionary process. First, ASEAN Centrality is about ASEAN offer the platform for all major dialogue partner to mingle, to talk, because on their own they cannot organize a meeting like this. Why can you organize a meeting like this in Indonesia and have soup buntut and talking and have coffee from Toraja? So it's the kinds of the atmosphere that ASEAN provide. ASEAN Centrality was first discussed when ASEAN draft the ASEAN Charter, before we talk about ASEAN Way, you know. So the second meaning of ASEAN Centrality is, during the past 10 years, ASEAN come to think that ASEAN Centrality is about agenda arrangement. I'm very careful. Agenda arrangement, because as director of ASEAN Tavares just told me, within ASEAN, when you have agenda, which one we would discuss first? Regional issue, international issue, Korean Peninsula, South China Sea. So ASEAN is very careful. This is the second meaning of ASEAN Centrality. We arrange the agenda. Now, we are moving to the third evolutionary process, just like automobile, we are going electronic. Now, ASEAN Centrality is moving, listen carefully, it will be in the examination for those who want to apply for the job at the Foreign Ministry. We are moving to the stage that ASEAN will initiate. ASEAN will take the control. ASEAN will display its vision. And I think one of the issues that will come in this year is Indo-Pacific concept. And I think Director Tavares will give you all the details, but I would like to say that ASEAN has already taken up the challenge posed by America presenting Indo-Pacific concept. We don't want to use America Indo-Pacific strategy, because ASEAN said we want to give our own stamp, we want to give our vision. So from now on, ASEAN will move to the third evolutionary process of centrality, that is, will we initiate, no longer offer as a fulcrum, you can always get the freebie meeting somewhere else. Second, we can set agenda, now we're gonna take over. So that is my second point. Third point, people always complain about consensus. People always complain about non-interference. Come on, these two principles enshrined in the UN charters, and you have UN Security Council today, have big argument, could not agree on anything. But ASEAN often agree on everything, except only one time only. It was in the year 2012. But I thought that was an aberration. So consensus will continue. Non-interference will continue. But there will be a big change, because ASEAN now is 51 years old. ASEAN is stronger. Each country wants a bigger space. They have a stronger arm, longer leg. Otherwise, you know, Indonesia would not get 31 gold in Asian game. Longer leg, run faster. So you need a little bit more room. So there will be what I would call disruptive consensus. Well, you will have some disruption, but in the end, ASEAN will agree. It will take some time. It will not be in the morning, it will not be at noon, it will not be in the evening. You work overtime, and then early at 3 o'clock, they would agree. That is disruptive consensus. We will agree on a consensus. It will take longer, for sure. You know why? ASEAN is a very strange animal. If you talk to every ASEAN leader, they said, we will not abide by any rule. We are free. But in the end, if ASEAN have to make a decision, it's always thinking of ASEAN interested. And I think this is the most important quality. That is why ASEAN is surviving. So the next step of ASEAN is this. Indonesia has already shown some good practices. That is, you submit yourself to voluntary action. For example, during the East Timor crisis, Indonesia was first asking the Thai, said, please help us, we need your help. So the non-interference disappear. It become coalitions of willing. So this is the kind of liberal interpretation of non-interference. In December 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi said, listen guys, I would like to brief you on the latest situation in Rakhine. So she invited all the ASEAN counterparts to Yangon and listened to her. Thailand in 2014 was the first ASEAN country to urge ASEAN leaders to discuss domestic politics inside Thailand. I thought that was crazy. It was crazy because Thailand invited all the ASEAN leaders to discuss and help promote democracy in Thailand. So that was in 2014 in Naypyidaw. So this kind of voluntary action, the new sense of coalition of willing, that the willingness of ASEAN to come out. Actually, the first leader who did that was in 1987 when Abdul Rahman Wahid came out to the meeting with a Manila meeting, said, I know what you want to talk about. I offer to brief you on the East Timor situation. That was my presentation, and I believe ASEAN is strong, ASEAN is relevant, ASEAN centrality is moving ahead to the third evolutionary process. Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih banyak Kun Kavi for the very optimistic presentation, optimistic view on ASEAN. So before I move to the next speaker, I would like to first invite response or questions from the audience. Can we just have one question? Okay, the gentleman in white is the first to raise his hand. Let's just have one question.
Thank you. To the Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask a question about, you said that non-interference policy is disappearing in the East Timor, but how about the non-interference policy in the Myanmar as what I see that many of the Asian countries would like to help the Myanmar, but in fact the Myanmar used that non-interference policy to deny all the Asians helping. Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question. I think Myanmar is learning. And actually, if you look at the situation in Rakhine State 2 years ago, today is different. AHA Center now has playing a very active role. Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines also provides assistance. And I think later this year, you will see much more program. And I think Myanmar is learning and have more confidence and trust in ASEAN. Remember, when ASEAN decide to take up on a regional issue within the ASEAN framework, ASEAN has to make sure, number one, the country that has the problem is willing. So I think this is in the process. It will take some time. And Myanmar, mind you, has 135 ethnic groups. You have to understand, and it takes time. And this is why Aung San Suu Kyi has to be also very careful and cohabitate, working together with the military. Thank you.
Thank you. Kun Kavi, thank you very much for the presentation. If I may surmise, the nutshell of your presentation is that you truly believe that ASEAN is evolving and even disrupting. And in this process of evolution, it will continue to be central and relevant in the region.
Oh, definitely. What is the option?
So
It's like oxygen in this room. You know, ASEAN, really, you need ASEAN because ASEAN is very benign. You cannot blame ASEAN. You know, you can only blame ASEAN for talking too much. Talking too much is good because it's increased understanding. It will lead to common action. It takes time. You cannot. You know, you want to show things, it takes time.
Of course, sometimes ASEAN do take its times. As people will say, it is better at walking than running, but they do reach their destinations in the end.
Definitely, if ASEAN take up the task, ASEAN always finish it.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Kun Kavi. Can we have a round of applause for Kun Kavi? Kun Kavi, unfortunately, will have to leave first. So hopefully you will have a wonderful and safe journey, Kun Kavi, back to Bangkok. And we truly thankful for your presence. And again, one more round of applause for Kun Kavi, ladies and gentlemen.
Terima kasih banyak.
Terima kasih. Okay. Thank you very much, Kun Kavi. So for the next presentation, Your Excellency Ambassador Tavares, I'm afraid that Kun Kavi leave you with a number of homework that you have to answer. Indo-Pacific is primary among them. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think Dr. Kavi actually has provided his views, which more or less identifying the ASEAN centrality, the characteristics of ASEAN centrality, which is, I believe, our identification and of the characteristics of ASEAN centrality, more or less the same. As I'm an insider, working from inside, he's from outside, observing it. Now, what is ASEAN centrality actually? So just want to make sure, what do we mean by ASEAN centrality? ASEAN centrality actually is the ability of ASEAN, to create ASEAN-led mechanisms. There are a lot of ASEAN-led mechanisms in the region, as you see. You see here, ASEAN in the middle, and you have the ASEAN +1 mechanisms, and then you have the ASEAN +3 mechanisms. Here, ASEAN Russia, ASEAN US, ASEAN New Zealand, ASEAN India, and then you have East Asia Summit, ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus, and then you have the ASEAN Regional Forum. So actually, if you see in this diagram, a visualization of ASEAN centrality, any wider regional architecture will revolve around the center. Will revolve around the center, which is here. Any wider regional architecture will revolve around the center, which is ASEAN. So this is one of the reflection of ASEAN centrality, the convening power of ASEAN. Based on all of this mechanism, there are convening power of ASEAN. Why is it so important, the convening power of ASEAN? You have, at the level of working group, senior officials, foreign ministers, or any other ministers, agriculture, tourism, industry, and so on, and you have up to the top leader. Now, what is the difference? If you go to the UN General Assembly, you have a speech from a head of state. There is no head of state. Listen to it. You know, only diplomats there, junior diplomats taking notes. But here, all of the leaders sitting around look eye to eye and discuss strategic issues. So this is convening power of ASEAN. That is a characteristic of ASEAN centrality. Now, ASEAN also set the agenda. By having this mechanism, actually ASEAN set the agenda. Set the agenda and set the future direction. Now, sorry. ASEAN set the agenda, and this is one of the agenda which is set the future direction of ASEAN. Now, if you see it here, here is the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The Treaty of Amity and Cooperation actually is acceded by now 37 countries. You have all of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council acceding to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in the region, and it continued to increase. Very recently, like 3 months ago, we have the additional of Argentina and Iran to become high contracting parties of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. What does it mean? It means that ASEAN really in the center, and you see all of the countries around it. It is really the centrality of ASEAN that is reflected in this Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is creating a habit of dialogue and consultation, as well as peaceful settlement of disputes, of the resolution that is being provided. Now, if you look at the characteristics, the setting, the future, the direction of ASEAN, you can go through so many concepts, so many strategies that ASEAN has provided. Master plan of ASEAN, connectivity, disaster management, you have the transnational crimes, trafficking in person, counterterrorism, maritime cooperation. Of course, these are all big agendas that ASEAN is setting in the region, and it's supported by all of the dialogue partners around. You know what? Now ASEAN has 11 full dialogue partners. These are the dialogue partners of ASEAN. These are around here, including the United Nations, which is 11. Now we have Germany as a development partner, Switzerland as a sectoral dialogue partner, Pakistan, Norway, and Turkey. They are here are the sectoral dialogue partners of ASEAN. And yet, there are 25 other countries queuing to become dialogue partner of ASEAN, but ASEAN said that, sorry, we are already full. We are extremely busy, you know. So this, what does it mean? It's a reflection of the attraction of ASEAN. This is ASEAN centrality. Now, I'm coming to my last point, which is Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, you know that now there is a shift in geopolitical and geostrategic landscape in the world. There are increasing power of China, of India. There are uncertainties in the world, dynamism at the global level, at the regional level, major powers rivalry with proxy tendencies. They all come with their own strategies. You have the quadrilateral security dialogue, you have open and free Indo-Pacific and so on, you have the SAGAR from India. Now ASEAN is in the process of finalizing its own collective ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific strategy. Next month, ASEAN will have a common perspective on the Indo-Pacific during the East Asia Summit. It will go further to next year to present ASEAN its own outlook of a collective outlook on the Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Excellency, for again a very optimistic view. You first. Now for the next speaker, Dr. Tang Siew, who look like he's preparing some critical remarks on the previous speakers. No, I'm just kidding. Dr. Tang Siew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Selamat sore, good afternoon. Thank you for the organizers and to Ambassador Dino Jalal for giving me the privilege to be here and also to be on this very distinguished panel and to my learned to be on the panel with my learned colleagues. ASEAN centrality, as the Honorable Indonesia Foreign Minister said this morning, is not a cliche. It's something that we live, something that we support, something that is real, something we can touch. But it's also something very abstract, very fuzzy that we use it without knowing what it is. I concur with my colleagues that have spoken and also the colleagues who will be speaking soon on what the broad parameters is. But just let me perhaps quickly bring you through 3 dimensions or 3 perspectives on how we look at ASEAN centrality. The one dimension, the first dimension which we always overlooked is actually how ASEAN itself look at centrality. What do I mean ASEAN? ASEAN member states. How does Indonesia look at ASEAN centrality? How does Singapore look at it? How does Laos look at it? How does Cambodia look about it? If the ASEAN component member states do not support ASEAN centrality, then we should not have expect others to actually support it. So ASEAN centrality begins with the ASEAN member states. And this goes to the heart of all things ASEAN, which is the cohesion, the unity. So without the sentimentality, the support, and then the vision to think regionally and to act regionally, there is no ASEAN. In fact, there is no purpose to have ASEAN. There is always this debate, this push and pull, this swimming against the current of national interest versus regional interest. And in all times, in most times, I would say, the national interest would win, because foreign policy is an extension of national politics, national interest. Anybody who tell you otherwise is a liar or is a very good politician, right? Because without the national politics, there will be no representation of Indonesia, of Malaysia, of Singapore. So, but there are times that where the national interest does converge with the regional interest. That's where we find the lush common ground for regional cooperation. And ASEAN has been fortunate to craft this cooperation, and Ambassador Tavares have been at the forefront at championing this with his colleagues, 9 other colleagues, this functional cooperation with among the 10 ASEAN member states, and hopefully 11 member will come on board soon. And this is the first dimension, how we look at it. Secondly is how ASEAN looks at it as a collective. When we come together, what does ASEAN mean? Are we going to speak together as one? As Ambassador has mentioned, that we are trying to come up with a common position on Indo-Pacific. We may have individual positions, which may contradict, which may support, but it is very different if ASEAN were to agree on one single document, to speak with one single voice, and it will be a larger voice. So centrality has to be at a regional level. And last but not least, the third dimension is how our dialogue partners, how our external parties look at centrality. Yeah, we hear our major dialogue partners, especially the major powers, the China, the America, the Japans, and so on, that centrality is the cornerstone of their engagement with ASEAN. Yeah, easier said than done. But when you operationalize it, what does that mean, right? And please do not quote me, do not put on Facebook. And I think to me, U.S. affirmation of ASEAN centrality has failed this coming November, when the U.S. president is not coming for the ASEAN East Asia Summit in that sense, because it is a leaders-led summit. It's about showing up, right? And also the president not coming for the meeting, just attending East Asia Summit lunch last year, is also a somewhat let down in that sense. So centrality is not just about showing up, but it's about showing up with substance, with engaging the ASEAN member states. More importantly, centrality is not something that you pity ASEAN, you agree with ASEAN, it's not a membership fee that you pay. But centrality works for the ASEAN member states as much as it works for the dialogue partners and the major powers, right? Ambassador has mentioned the great convening power that is ASEAN. Just a few days ago, we concluded the ASEAN Defense Minister Meeting Plus, right? You also heard in the last month or so, U.S. Secretary of State Mattis was supposed to meet with his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Minister of Defense, and that meeting was cancelled because of the ongoing U.S.-China trade war. But they met in Singapore under the umbrella of the ADMM Plus. This is the power of ASEAN. This is the power of ASEAN centrality. It brings people together when they cannot meet individually or bilaterally in that sense. We are an accepted platform. We can bring people together, we can bring their differences aside. How do we play this role? We can only play this role by being neutral, by not taking sides, by not favoring each other or one side over the other. But neutrality does not mean that we don't take sides. We don't take positions, sorry. We don't take sides, but we should take positions, because positions based on principles. ASEAN has to have principles. If not otherwise, we will always be muted. We will always have nothing to say. Therefore, rules the rule of law, right? International arbitration and all these things are very important. Otherwise, we will relapse into a region where might is right, yeah, the strong would intimidate others. We are also an honest broker, we are open regionalism, yeah, therefore we are welcoming to all. Big or small, everybody that comes to ASEAN, we treat everybody equally. We treat ourselves equally as well. From the smallest to the biggest country, Brunei, smallest, yeah, Indonesia, biggest, we all sit at the same table, everybody have their same interest, one vote. Yeah, and similarly, when the major powers come to us, cooperation in the region, it is the same. So centrality, if it's missing, if it's diluted, if it's lost, yeah, of course, ASEAN will be at a loss. But the major loss will be our external partners. Right? We are the glue that brings people together. That's where through either the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Summits, ASEAN +3, ASEAN +1, people come to Southeast Asia to meet, to discuss about the region, and more importantly, and some of the times, they meet among themselves, right? So we are the equivalent to the, ancestral home of the region, if you can put it this way, right? We go back to our Hari Raya, our Lunar New Year, we go back to our grandparents, our parents. When your parents are gone, like mine, nobody comes home anymore because there's nothing to glue them together. ASEAN plays that role. So if ASEAN strategy is diluted, US, Japan, China, Australia, New Zealand, India have no reason to come to the region at one particular point in time. So we are the convener of the most important party, to use the word. Why we're important? Because we are not just fun, but we are meaningful, we are substantive. We may not get things done all the time, but diplomacy is about negotiation, it's about talking, it's about working through problems. It is better for us to talk a lot than not to talk at all, because not talking means that we have downgraded our relationship. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Tang Siew. Very well said. The centrality is central to ASEAN. And in that centrality is first and foremost, the one that should held it true is ASEAN member states. ASEAN member states should believe in its own centrality. But perhaps the question is then, who should champion centrality in the region? Does it fall to the original five? Is there common perceptions on centrality, as you mentioned as well? There is a difference between common and individual perception, and it is something that ASEAN should also do some soul searching, I think. Next speaker, we have Professor Heydarian to provide his perspective. Professor Heydarian, the floor is yours.
Sorry, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure it's a pleasure to come after all of those wonderful presentations. A little bit upbeat. Well, let me just be clear. I spent almost a decade in the Middle East, and with the Game of Thrones situation going on there, actually, I'm sure they would love to have an ASEAN. So when I criticize ASEAN, and sometimes, unfortunately, I'm known for that, I do it from a position of what, in Espanol we call cariño brutal, love with some sort of, punch there, right? The thing is this, a Singaporean colleague once said that the ASEAN is not a horse, but it's more like a cow, right? So a horse, you can train it, it can run, it's swift, it's flashy, it's brazen, it can get things done. While a cow just does his own thing. He just goes around and eats whatever grass he wants. My position is perhaps the way forward, and the more realistic way forward is a donkey, right? In the Middle East, donkeys are very useful. Or if you can read Don Quixote, and you can see how donkeys can help in many ways. It may not be as swift and fast and efficient as a horse, but not also as, scattered in attention and pointless and lost, perhaps, as a cow. And I think, in fact, the better way of looking at ASEAN is that it depends on the issue you're talking about. I think when it comes to economic integration, we were able to actually achieve the free trade area in the ASEAN ahead of schedule, which created so much optimism, over-optimism, that we could create an economic community by 2015. But we're still more or less on track when it comes to pushing forward for greater economic integration. So we are kind of a horse, actually, when it comes to economic integration in ASEAN. So it actually disappoints me when I hear this categorical characterization of ASEAN as too slow and inefficient. My question always is, on what issue, right? And I think in economics in ASEAN, we have done a fantastic job, right, of bringing down tariff barriers, and now we're moving towards eliminating non-tariff barriers, which is going to be difficult, but this is something that we're looking at. I'm also very optimistic, a country like the Philippines, as I always say, we tend to feel more at home in Mexico than in Malaysia, right? Because we're so far away from the rest of ASEAN culturally and even geographically. And yet, ASEAN consciousness is actually gaining ground even in places like the Philippines, right? And I think that's, again, a positive thing that we have to embrace and celebrate. Nonetheless, there are also areas whereby the ASEAN is more like a cow than a horse, right? And I think South China Sea, since we're talking about sea change, right, is an important issue. You don't need to believe in Thucydides' trap, right, or read Graham Allison's thesis to believe that, South China Sea could be the next theater of a global competition, right, between the global powers. If, God forbid, there'll be a war, a third world war, this is the new battlefield, right? And yet, when you look at the ASEAN response, I think there is a lot of room for improvement. And this brings me to my thesis. My thesis is the ASEAN is reaching some sort of a middle age crisis, or I would, in a much more jargonesque way, I call it the middle institutionalization trap. It's kind of like middle income trap, right? How does middle income trap situation come into being? So the kind of policies that allow poor countries to reach the level of middle income development, right, are not going to be helpful once you want to move to the high income level of development. So for instance, in the case of China, cheap labor, among other things, help them to go from low income to middle income. But that's not going to help them to go towards a 21st century high-tech economy. So they have to bring in new policies and new institutional arrangements. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping is trying to do. We can talk about whether he's doing it right or wrong. My contention is ASEAN is facing a similar kind of problem, whereby the consensus-based decision-making, the consultation-based decision-making procedure was fantastic for us when we're building amity among ourselves. But as we reach a certain level of maturity in terms of our institutionalization, we're also reaching some sort of a ceiling. And the ceiling is very clear in South China Sea because some external powers, which countries are we talking about, have exploited that notion of consensus-based decision-making in order to push for their own individual agenda. Because in the case of ASEAN, we do not understand consensus really as consensus. We understand it sometimes as unanimity. So for an external power to impose its will on ASEAN, all it has to do is to just convince one country, right? Just one country to say no and nothing happens. And I think that's where, for instance, in the South China Sea, we're facing a significant problem in dealing with China because we cannot arrive at consensus because of the diversity of perceptions. Now, that is why my contention is the best way to save ASEAN multilateralism is to embrace some kind of ASEAN minilateralism. I don't think the two are necessarily contradictory or mutually exclusive. Many people will disagree with me, but in my opinion, sometimes coordination among a limited number of ASEAN countries on a specific issue could create actually better results than waiting forever to get results on the level of the ASEAN. That is why, for instance, one of my proposals is a negotiation of a code of conduct among ASEAN claimant states themselves on the issue of South China Sea. Why should we wait for China? We're not really going anywhere. In fact, even my contention is the Philippine Arbitration Award, which is final and binding per international law. Why not allow it to be the basis for negotiation of territorial maritime delimitation between Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam? So there's a lot that we can do on contentious issues on the South China Sea by actually keeping it within very limited number of countries who are like-minded and who have direct interests. So I don't blame when Cambodia complains when Hun Sen says, don't drag us into this issue, because they don't have a direct interest, right? They have more interest in preserving their bilateral relations with China. And in the same way, I feel for Cambodia and Laos and those countries because, archipelagic Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, we don't help them much when it comes to Mekong River issues, for instance. That's why in the Mekong River, you also have some sort of minilateral cooperation among countries that are directly influenced. And then, of course, there are other issues whereby we're more like a donkey. Counterterrorism. So last year in my country, in the Philippines, we had the Marawi crisis. God forbid, we almost had a situation like Mosul, where ISIS elements were on the verge of occupying a full-fledged city. We prevented that, but that was a wake-up call. The liberation of Marawi is not over. The liberation of Marawi just showed us the depth of the terrorism challenge we're facing in the region. Thankfully, under President Duterte and the Philippine chairmanship of ASEAN last year, we moved forward towards greater intelligence sharing, tactical cooperation, and joint maritime patrols with Indonesia and Malaysia. But those kinds of activities are not complete yet. There is much more to be done. So in short, the ASEAN, it's a 50 shades of gray. I'll just keep it there.
I feel like I should ask for clarification on that final point, but I'll leave it at that as well. It's interesting that you point out about Mekong River issue as well, because I think it also speaks to the point that how centrality is being perceived and how ASEAN matters differently on different issues to different countries on different levels. But last but not least, I will give the floor to our final speaker today, Ms. Letuha. Ms. Letuha, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's really great honor for me to be here to speak in front of all of you about ASEAN. And my presentation is just my personal view, and it doesn't reflect any of the view of my institution. Today, I just come here to talk about what I want to continue what my colleague Richard Heydarian just finished. He talked about what should ASEAN do in the South China Sea dispute. So I just want to highlight why we should do it now. I want to emphasize why ASEAN should emphasize its own role in South China Sea dispute. I think there are three main reasons for that. Firstly, I think it's the time that ASEAN is now getting the support from the great powers. Actually, people talking to many realists, they thought that now South China Sea dispute is the game between the big power, is the game between the US and China. I myself also a realist, but here I argue that ASEAN can interfere because we get the support, we get the agreement of the great power to interfere, and that's the opportunity to develop our own interest. Firstly, talk about China. I think this is the first time why China stick with ASEAN in the COC process. People talk about what is calculated behind, but I think that this is the first time China is sitting down with us and listen to us. So we should take this opportunity to share the idea that is benefit to the claimant state, to ASEAN state. And also, talking about the US, my colleague mentioned the Indo-Pacific, mentioned the ASEAN centrality. So now we get the call from the great power. Why not answer it in the way that the ASEAN state get the most interest? And my second reason is that ASEAN is capable of doing the good things. I think we are way better than just a talk shop. A talk shop is a good word, but we should be better than just talking. We know we have the soft power. ASEAN has the experience solving the dispute before, and we also have the hard power as well. We know the population of ASEAN is 10% of the whole world, and also if we are united as a single economy, we rank 5th in the world. So I think that we are powerful enough and respectful enough to have the voice in the South China Sea dispute, to have the voice in the issues that included a lot of our member states. And last but not least, I think that now the South China Sea dispute is the question of surviving to ASEAN. It's the regional issues. If we don't have the voice inside, we can become invisible to the international community. We can become invisible to other member states. And also with the recent development in the South China Sea, some people say that the dispute is becoming a conflict. And if the conflict leads to the war, and if the people die at the sea, so it's not the problem of the claimant state anymore. It becomes the problem of the whole region. It becomes the question of survival of ASEAN. So I think it's time we do something. And that's bring me to the end of my presentation. I don't provoke any kind of war. I just want to say that we should take our role. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Latufa. As my colleague mentioned, the criticism coming all toward the end. It's a very beautiful point that you made. I think the key question that we should ask today is a recent book published by former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, Martina Talagawa, explain or try to explain why ASEAN matters. I think the question that we should ask today, does it though? How does it matter? To whom? To what extent? When we say that ASEAN is important, Professor Heydarian has mentioned that it is important economic issue. Kun Kavi and Ambassador Tavares has already explained that it is important on keeping peace and stability. But there is also talk about that can ASEAN attempt to answer issues that are not always urgent to all member states, like Mekong River issues, or with South China Sea, not all members are claimant states. And there are always issues like migrant workers or refugees that we did not talk much today. I think from what I may surmise from this talk today, the question is, when we want to say that ASEAN is center, as Dr. Tang mentioned, we have to ensure that it is central to all member states first. But perhaps the further question then is, how do we ensure that ASEAN is central to its member states? How do we ensure that ASEAN matters? I think that's a key question. Before I leave the floor to the audience to answer, I would like to give a chance, perhaps, as another concluding remark, but to to Excellency Ambassador Tavares, because there are a number of I wouldn't say criticism, but critical takes on the path that ASEAN is taking from within. What is your view on these criticisms?
I have to be very frank that I don't know I don't hear clearly. I mean, the room is too big, and perhaps you're asking about the South China Sea or some other. Oh yeah, look, ASEAN member states have their past allegiances, some alliance even. So having these diverse of foreign policy orientations does not mean that ASEAN doesn't have common interest for moving in its external relations. Although it have its own inclination since its establishment, since the peak of the Cold War, some to the west, some to the east, yeah, their allegiance and their alliances. However, ASEAN remain strong common grounds to move with its external relations. That's why it survived. So despite the fact, so we do not expect that all of the ASEAN member states will relinquish their policy orientation towards major powers. They still remain and will be the same, remain like that for the future. My point is that although we have our own policy orientation, which is quite diverse, yet we find there are common ground for external relations. Now I would like to also relate the issue, since South China Sea has been talked a lot about, and indeed in 2012 the joint communique of ASEAN has failed to, for the first time, and perhaps the only time where ASEAN failed to come up with the joint communique because of one ASEAN member states disagree to insert the South China Sea in the joint communique, which is Cambodia, of course, we all know. Now, this kind of issue, if you remember, Pa Martin Atalgawa have a diplomatic trip around ASEAN countries, and it was rectified. The damage was then rectified with the 5 principles that was presented at the time. But it is true that in a certain aspects, when we come to the discussion of the South China Sea, there is difficulties because the allegiance of certain ASEAN member states are quite strong. You have to admit it. I think this is already a public secret on that. Now, for the resolution of the South China Sea, if you take out China even, ASEAN member states, the 4 claimant states, overlap one another. And this is, even without China, it is very difficult to resolve. Why? ASEAN, in fact, had its limitation. Its limitation precisely on the issues of sovereignty. That part, that limitation on the sovereignty, which is ASEAN member states at this point in time, are not willing to render it to ASEAN. So in terms of territorial unresolved disputes in the area, it's many. You have Indonesia with Malaysia, you have Thailand and Cambodia, let alone the multiple claims in the South China Sea. Now, to resolve this issue of the South China Sea, you're right, they can go through, why not ASEAN start a bilateral negotiations of delimitation of their own maritime boundaries. They can start with China as well. ASEAN cannot resolve that. It is proven that in the history, ASEAN cannot resolve territorial or jurisdictional disputes. Si Padang Ligitan, there is a bilateral negotiation, we didn't come up with the result, and we went to the International Court of Justice. Thailand and Cambodia border. ASEAN can provide an enabling environment, a conducive environment for the resolution of the dispute peacefully. But ASEAN cannot. ASEAN are not able at this point in time to resolve the jurisdictional disputes. You know why? Even though you use the TAC, will not be able to resolve because ASEAN is not willing. ASEAN member states are not willing to give the authority to ASEAN to do that. Now, who is going to resolve? The ASEAN foreign ministers sitting in the High Council of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation? Do you think that foreign ministers will agree on 1 meter or 1 centimeter of their territory? Of course not. They have the political baggage. If a foreign minister agrees that, okay, this part it belongs to you, it will immediately be replaced. The political baggage for a foreign minister to resolve jurisdictional disputes, territorial disputes, is too heavy. That is why, first, the most ideal option to resolve a territorial dispute is through negotiation. If they agree on certain aspects, it will fine. The negotiation will take long. But if it reach an agreement on that, it is good. Second option is that go to an international court to decide on that. Like si Padang Nagitan, if you decide on that, we have to accept it. The third option actually, pending the resolution of territorial disputes, you can have a joint cooperation. Multiple claims like the South China Sea will take decades, hopefully not centuries. So this is my point. If you talk about territorial disputes, jurisdictional disputes in ASEAN, there is a limitation of ASEAN, and I don't want to give an expectation, will be over expectation, and will be disappointed on that. Because ASEAN member states are not prepared to give it.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the somber answer. I would like to give a chance for the audience to ask a question. Can we have 3 questions? Is there anyone from that side? I only saw a question from this side. Okay, the gentleman in the front first, and then the gentleman in the middle with the black shirt, and one in the very, very back of the row. Can we give a microphone to the... Okay. Please state your question briefly and kindly tell us to which speakers you address the question to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Hans Vriend. I have a question actually for the panel. I was a bit surprised to hear, I mean, I'm all in favor of ASEAN. I think it's all important, but I think ASEAN is missing the boat in one area completely. And I was a bit surprised to hear that you're praising ASEAN for its economic integration. However, if you look at the ASEAN Economic Community, that was, according to the ASEAN leaders, achieved in 2015, that means in ASEAN we now have the free flow of investment, services, and a freer flow of skilled labor. None of them has achieved and nothing is done about it. So how can we call it a success?
Let's take the round of questions first. And then the gentleman in the middle with the black shirt. Again, please state the question briefly and to whom you would like to address the question to.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon, everyone. To the fourth speaker, Your Excellency, I want to ask you about how ASEAN faces the Indo-Pacific and Indo-China concept. As we know that a few years ago, we have heard a concept called Indo-China. So how ASEAN faces that two concepts between the Indo-Pacific and Indo-China concept? Thank you.
Thank you. I take it you are asking a question to Ambassador Tavares? Or
the professor who used...
Professor Heydarian?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And Indo-China. I think about the history of the question. And the person on the very final row in the back, please. Yeah, with the two hands. Yeah, but yeah. Please.
Hello everyone. My name is Famara from the Gambia, an international relations student at UIN Sharif Hidayatullah. My question goes to Professor Javad from Philippines. I mean, your name is a little bit. Anyway, if my memory could serve me, last year and on the same conference you talked about, your stand was that Indonesia should take a step in leading the confrontation towards China for the dispute in the South China Sea. But now you have a shift. That is to say that the claimant countries should be the one to come together, to find a solution to this. So among these claimants, you are not specific. Last time you were specific, but to this one, who now among the claimants should take the lead to say, hey, we need to solve this problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think most of the question is, I think we're running out of time. Unfortunately, I'm afraid we are running out of time, so yeah, it's too bad. But of course, we always have the time to talk to the panelists later, and you are free to have a doorstop interview later. I think most of the question is aimed actually to Professor Heydarian from your, I think it's a good sign, from praising economic integration, where is the proof between the Pacific and Indo-China, as well as the final question as well on the South China Sea, I think.
Yeah, I'll just try to be quick as much as possible. I said, so when I say in the economic front, we're more like a horse. I mean, obviously I said we missed the 2015 target, but I'm saying compared to other areas, I think the economic front, we have done relatively better. And again, my standard is very relative by ASEAN standards. So it's not EU standard, but this is always what I say. It's like marriage, right? If you're not ready, don't get into it. And what I mean by not ready, because what's the point of agreeing to free flow of labor and capital and all, but you don't have compliance enforcement mechanism? What happens if Singapore and Malaysia follow it, but Thailand and Philippines keep on cheating? Then you're going to have problems. Then you're going to have even more fights among these countries. So first get the bureaucratic question right, because EU, with what, 200,000 bureaucrats, it's still not getting it right. and ASEAN has what, 300 bureaucrats with a budget of what, $20 million? So my question is, first get the capacity building, compliance, enforcement question right before we go to the next stage. So I think the economic integration in terms of common market is still a step too far. But at least in terms of AFTA CEPT, we were ahead of the curve. So just to clarify that, I only had like 5 minutes. The thing on the code of conduct, no, I'm not necessarily changing my position. What I'm saying is, it has to be primarily between Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia. I don't know about Brunei. Do they actively still claim things? But Indonesia and Singapore, right, as the de facto leaders of ASEAN, should also facilitate from behind the scenes. I think Pak Jalal has been pushing for this also from the last year. I agree with that. I think these are two countries with the punch, with the diplomatic finesse, and I think they have to push for that. The problem, though, is election cycles. So Philippines was supposed to be the country leading the process. Two things happened. A, where was ASEAN when the arbitration award came out? I heard nothing from the ASEAN, as if the Philippine arbitration award never happened, even if this was in accordance with international law, and individual statements from each country, including Indonesia. I'm sorry, it was very disappointing. The second thing is we got suddenly Duterte, who completely changed, the picture. So I think, we took the punches when we had the time. I think it's time for Vietnam and maybe Malaysia now with the new leadership to push for a tougher position, right? So as I always say, I think a lot of countries were piggy banking on us, the Philippines, to stand up to China, and I don't think we were getting enough love from ASEAN. I think this is time for other countries to step up to the plate. I know it sounds like buck passing, but I think these are some of the realities what we have to take into consideration. And I think the problem with the South China Sea is this. It is, yes, there is a sovereignty aspect, but South China Sea is a global sea lines of communication. If something goes wrong there, everyone is going to get affected in one way or another. So it's not like, Ligitan or Sipita. It's not like Sabah. It's not a bilateral sovereignty territorial dispute only. It's actually a global security issue. And it's the overlapping of those elements that make it highly complicated, but also a very high stakes issue. And I believe ASEAN cannot get it wrong. So you're absolutely right to say that there's limitation to the ASEAN, but my fear is that if that limitation means we won't get it right, it might influence everything else. Because if something happens in South China Sea, it's going to affect the other ASEAN in other areas where we're actually doing well. So I'll just keep it there.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Tavares, I know you're itching to provide an answer, but if you can be very brief about it, and Dr. Tang, Siew, can I give you both 1 minute each to answer the question? Okay, 1 minute each first.
Sorry, just very quickly, I know time is running out. On your question, does ASEAN matter and how ASEAN matters, let me give you two anecdotes. Yeah? Recently, one colleague was advising the Australian government, forget about ASEAN, just focus on Southeast Asian nations, right? And there was also another colleague to sort of advise the UK government post-Brexit for UK to forget about ASEAN, just focus on a few of the Southeast Asian countries that matter. That's where you're going to get your most buck. I think they're all wrong, right? The approach for these countries is you have to go both. Diplomatically, your bilateral relations matter, but your regional relations matter. And why? Imagine if Australia were to forgo ASEAN, which is not going to happen, hypothetically. If that happens, which means they are not going to focus on a few countries that really matters to them, have very good ties. Of course, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, but you are going to miss out on Brunei, on Laos, and so on. So you're not going to touch on the whole region in that sense, right? So, and when ASEAN does a lot of things, ADMM plus and so on, you are going to miss out as well. When we are going to work with our external parties, you are going to be sidelined. You are not going to work with us, you're not going to work with New Zealand, you're not going to work with China, you're going to work with Japan. You are shooting yourself in the foot. And for ASEAN member states, if you are not in ASEAN, you are going to miss out engaging with this, because there are some countries that are perceived by EU, by others, not conforming to their labor law standards, human rights standards, military coup. Therefore, we downgrade relationship, or we have very little relationship. But as member of ASEAN, you get to meet all the leaders in the summit at least once a year. Your diplomatic profile is enhanced many times through ASEAN, no matter your size in that sense. This is what ASEAN brings to you in only one sector, which is the diplomatic sector, right? Imagine what other sectors. Right. Maybe just two very quick points. I think the AEC 2015, we should take it in the ASEAN context. It is not meant 2015 we are going to complete everything. In fact, it was brought forward in order to give impetus to push ASEAN. We know we are going to fail, but we want to have a wake-up call. These are our failings. 2015, we better move forward in that sense. It's to put pressure on us in that sense, right? It was 2020, if I'm not mistaken, the deadline. We brought forward. And even 2015, we know we're not going to finish it. Therefore, we have a phase 2, we have a phase 3. So it is a work in progress. So this is not the end. We're going to stop working. So I hope our friends, our investors will be patient with us. On the last point, I think, Richard, I have to disagree with you. I think this is where you have to be consistent and not confuse us all, right? In the Arbitral Tribunal, in the moment that it came out, the Manila was very clear. This is not an ASEAN issue, this is a bilateral issue. Manila took it off the table. So there was no ASEAN position, but we have to be clear, there was ASEAN member states position. Singapore, nearly all of us, even Cambodia issued a statement. You can criticize, you can analyze what those statements are, but we did not close our eyes to say it did not happen. Yeah? Yes, we did play the game, we will not be as forceful as, to be fair, even the EU chicken out. Right? Nearly everybody chicken out in that sense, right?
Thank you.
So I guess we have to be very, very clear on that, not to be further. Last 2 sentences, if I may. The South China is important. I think I agree with Richard, this is an international issue because the ceilings of communication. The claimant states should talk among themselves because ultimately the resolution have the claimant states. But there are also interests and stakes with the non-claimant states, such as Indonesia, such as Malaysia, Singapore, because of the sea lines of communication. So everybody interested have been taken, Japan's interests have been taken into consideration, South Korea as well, Australia as well. So it's going to be very complicated. Therefore, I think to get everybody on board is going to be complex. This is where ASEAN is important because the code of conduct at least try to set certain norms of behavior, certain low level. We're not going to matter much, but it's better than zero. So let's not cut or let's not sell ourselves short. China has shown interest in the code of conduct, surprise. Yeah, there may be an ulterior motive behind it, but nevertheless, all ASEAN and China, we are on board for the first time in a long time, then we are serious in the code of conduct. So it is up to Philippines as the chair of the coordinator ASEAN-China relationship to actually push through after the hard work that has been done in the last 3 years by Singapore with the support of the ASEAN member states.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tan Siew Mun. Yes. Okay. So I will give Ms. Letuha very briefly first.
I just want to put very small comment. Actually, I think that it's time for us to think as ASEAN people. We don't think about like we are a country inside ASEAN because we are ASEAN community. So it's time to think as ASEAN people, as ASEAN policy, and I think that's the meaning of being unity. We can have the limit, but that the limit is not because like there's someone inside. We should think that way, and I think that is the most important point of being united ASEAN community.
Thank you. And we owe His Excellency a chance to answer.
Just one small point on the so that we not get confused between the resolution of the dispute, territorial disputes in the South China Sea with the code of conduct. Of course, ASEAN's role is in the code of conduct. It is to create a conducive environment. What is a code of conduct? It is to prevent incidents from happening and manage it if it do happen and continue with the confidence building measures. That's a code of conduct. It's not a resolution of the territorial dispute. So there are totally 2 different things. Now ASEAN can play on the code of conduct, but not in the resolution. There is no such a precedent in the international group right now, in the international practices, whether a regional organization can resolve territorial disputes. That's all I want to say. I hope that colleagues in Indonesia, they continue to participate and see the possibilities, how they can benefit from ASEAN as well. So I think this is important. A lot of people outside ASEAN, outside Southeast Asia that have interest in engaging in ASEAN, so does, I think, ASEAN community should pay more attention to the ASEAN community building and participate and get the benefit from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Tavares. I will take that as a concluding remark. Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause and thank you to our panelists. A big one. I do hope that this panel would have given you more answers and even more questions. We can always have more discussions in our way out. Thank you once again. Good evening.